We are so happy you are here tonight for this wonderful evening with Jamie Bernstein. She is the eldest daughter of Leonard Bernstein and Felicia Montalegre. Did you get it? Okay. Jamie is the author of Famous Father, Girl, a memoir of growing up Bernstein. I'd like to thank everyone for coming. I'd like to thank the friends of the library who make these programs possible. And we'd like to thank Barrett Bookstore who have the books for sale. And Jamie will sign afterwards. Please silence your phone so we have no other music tonight. We'll take questions at the end, towards the end of the program. And let me tell you a little bit about Jamie. Jamie Bernstein is a writer, broadcaster, and filmmaker. She travels the world as a concert narrator. Her documentary, Crescendo, The Power of Music, is available on Netflix, and she resides with her dog and maybe some other people in New York City. We're so happy you're here. Thank you for coming.
Hello, everybody. Good evening. How wonderful that you all came out on this rather chilly evening. Can you hear me okay? Okay, and I'm just going to tilt this over here because I don't really like standing behind podiums because I'm just too small and I just feel like I get swallowed up. So here's the plan for this evening. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how my book, Famous Father Girl, came to be, and I will tell you why I wrote it and what my intention was by writing it, and then I'll give you a little thumbnail sketch of the contents of the book, which I hope will whet your appetite to go and read the whole thing. I hope that happens. And then I'll tell you a little bit about my dad's centennial, which took place in 2018, which was a big event for my brother and sister and me, as you can imagine. And that was the year that my book came out, so I'll tell you a little bit about how the experience was of putting my book into the world. And then there will be, I'm guessing, a little time left to talk about the film Maestro, which just came out in the past months. How many of you have seen Maestro? I'm just curious. Holy Toledo! Okay, that's good. So you'll know what I'm talking about then. And yes? How's that? Okay, but you can still hear me okay? Thank you, that was a good idea, yeah. I have a couple of video clips to show you, and I'm hoping that all of what I just mentioned will still leave us with time for you to ask questions. So that's the plan, and here we go. So how this book came about is that I had an acquaintance who was a book agent, and I ran into him at a party, and I mentioned that I had sort of been toying with the idea of writing a memoir. And he said, well, you know, if you wrote a memoir and you keyed it into your dad and it came out during that centennial year, I bet you I could sell that book, and I bet you would sell a few copies. And I realized, oh my God, he's totally right. This is it. It was like he shot me out of a cannon. And so I started working on it right away. And sure enough, he sold it to HarperCollins. And sure enough, it came out in the centennial year. And that all worked really well. So that was good. And my intention with writing the book was really to answer the question that my brother and sister and I are constantly being asked by people and journalists and everybody. What was it like? What was it like to grow up in your family with that larger-than-life person for a father? So my short answer to that question was, well, it wasn't boring. But the longer answer to that question is my book. And there was a book to write precisely because it wasn't boring, right? And so, you know, I wanted to be able to share with the world some of what that experience was like. And in writing the book, I told my brother and sister, Alexander and Nina, that they had total veto power over everything I wrote, every word. And I ran everything by them first. And I said, if there's anything in there that you don't like, that you want me to say differently or take out, you pipe up. Because whatever winds up in this book has to be something that you feel okay with. Otherwise, I'm not going to do it. And they were incredibly supportive. In the end, they really just said, it's okay the way you're telling it, and go. So that was a big and crucial vote of confidence from Alexander and Nina. So, all right, so now I'm just going to, everything okay over there? Yes? Okay. So now I'll give you the little thumbnail sketch of the book. It's chronological, so it starts with my very earliest memories. And what I tried to do is I tried to put myself back in my childhood brain. And when you're a really little kid, all your understanding of the world is sensory because you haven't learned to read yet. So all your information is coming from how you perceive the world through your own body. So I tried to use a lot of visual and auditory and olfactory imagery because that's how I was understanding the world. And one of the olfactory memories has to do with cigarettes because my parents smoked their heads off, and so did everybody else in their world. You know how it was back then, most of you. Looked like you were around back then, and everybody smoked. Like chimneys. And I hated the smell of cigarettes. And what I especially hated, and I write about this in the book, is when one or another of my parents or whoever was driving the car would light up in the car. And they would very courteously open the window 1 inch, which was, useless. And that first blowing of smoke, that when you just light a cigarette, that smell was so awful. So I would hold my breath until the smoke would dissipate. And of course, I could never hold my breath long enough for the smoke to dissipate. And ultimately, the moment came where I would have to gasp for breath, and there was that disgusting smell. And every room had that grayish blue haze in it, especially my father's studio, which was always a haze of blue smoke. So that's kind of what the beginning of the book is like. And I talk about smoking all the way through because, of course, it turned out to be a very crucial element in the overall story because both of my parents died of lung cancer. So I kind of sneak it in there at the beginning, but it's a thread that runs through and turns out to be something very important later on. So I also talk about our household. My mother was from South America. She was raised in Chile. And so we had the incredible good fortune of growing up bilingual without having to work at it. Because at home, there was a lot of Spanish being spoken. Our nanny, Julia Vega, who was a character in the movie of Maestro. You don't see much of her, but anyway, there is a Julia. Julia was our nanny. From the time I was 2 years old, she arrived just when my brother was born. And then our sister Nina was born later. So Julia was basically part of the family from the very beginning. And so there was Julia, and there was a cook, Rosalia, who was also from Chile. And then there was a maid also. So it was a staff of 3 people in our house. And they all spoke Spanish. So everything going on around us at home was en español. And that was our very good fortune. So it really, in a way, was it my first language? Almost. I was learning English and Spanish simultaneously. And sometimes I got very confused. And also my mother had a kind of mid-Atlantic accent. She grew up in Chile, but went to a school where she learned English from people who had British accents. So she had this kind of British-sounding English that she spoke. And then my father grew up outside of Boston, and his parents were immigrants from Ukraine. And Sam Bernstein, my grandfather, came over when he was about 17, and he never lost his old world accent. He sounded a lot like Jackie Mason, the comedian, actually. He had that heavy way of talking. Whereas his wife, Jenny, my grandmother, she came over when she was younger, when she was about 8. And so she wound up having a kind of working class Massachusetts accent. So, you know, when we would gather at Christmas Eve and we would make our father go to the piano and play Christmas carols, Jenny would yell out, "Play Hark the Herald!" So there were a lot of ways of talking going on around me, and I thought that in the summer when we drove up to Martha's Vineyard, we would have to go through Cape Cod. Because Cape Cod, and that's how my mother talked, that's how Grandma talked. Like, I was very mixed up about things. So there's a lot of that in the book, too. And also, my father and his siblings were incredibly close. And they grew up very bunched together. They depended on each other to get through life and to feel bonded. And when my father was a little boy, he and a neighbor, Eddie Ryak, made up a language that they called Rye-Burnian. Ryak Bernstein, Rye-Burnian. Get it? So it was their secret language. And my father and his sister and brother used this Rye-Burnian all the time, and then we learned it as kids. And our mother was one of the very few non-Bernsteins who could speak Rye-Burnian. And so there was yet another language going on. There was language, words, and wordplay, and our father loved words. So that was all part of our growing up. And he was always talking about figures of speech. He taught us about figures of speech when we were like 5. And grammar. I learned what a verb and a noun was before I could write. So that was kind of the atmosphere. And then there were the people who were coming over to the house. And the thing about my mother was that she had this sense of grace and style. And she herself was extremely beautiful. And she had this way of making the house so yummy, so comfortable and attractive and fun to be in. And our parents were fun themselves. And so everybody always wanted to come to our house, to go over to be with Lenny and Felicia and eat that delicious food that the Chilean cook was making. And so everybody was coming over to the house. And those people that were coming over to the house were really something. So very early in the book, like on page 6, I have the sentence, "Let the name dropping begin." Because, you know, when you're a little kid, you don't know who your parents' friends are, and you don't really understand who your parents are in the context of the world they live in. But in point of fact, our parents were at the epicenter of mid-20th century American culture. And all their friends were part of that culture, and they were all coming over. So, you know, we didn't know it, but it was quite consequential to have not just our dad's collaborators, Steve Sondheim and Jerry Robbins and Lillian Hellman, coming over, but also their other friends, you know, Mike Nichols and Dick Avedon and Betty Bacall, as we called her. Betty Persky from the Bronx became Lauren Bacall, the actress. So you get the picture. It was a pretty high-powered, splashy atmosphere. And my brother and I, this was before our sister was born, my brother and I shared a bedroom upstairs, and we went to sleep listening to the sound of the grown-ups downstairs carrying on, screaming with laughter, roaring songs around the piano, and that was kind of our lullaby, you know, the sound of the grown-ups having a lot of fun downstairs. We couldn't wait to be grown-ups. It was going to be so much fun to be a grown-up and play all those games, the charades and the treasure hunts, and sing songs around the piano and be all glamorous smoking cigarettes. We just couldn't wait to be that. And there was one specific day, when we realized maybe being a grown-up was more complicated than we realized. And that day was November 22nd, 1963, when President Kennedy was assassinated. And I was in 6th grade. And that was the first day I ever saw my parents cry, or any grown-ups, really. And they all came over, all those grown-ups that were always laughing and singing and carrying on. They all came over crying and sitting all together in front of the TV and not knowing what to do with themselves. It was a terrible day, of course, for everyone. And that was the day when I thought, ugh, grown-ups aren't always happy after all. And then, strangely enough, that most terrible day for grown-ups was followed just a few months later by the most wonderful day for people my age. And that was the day, and we just had the 60th anniversary of this day, when the Beatles arrived at Idlewild Airport so that 2 days later they could go on the Ed Sullivan Show. And let me tell you, that was a very important day in my life. So I have a whole chapter about the Beatles because I was such a Beatle maniac. And very lucky for me, my father loved the Beatles too. And I mean, he wasn't in love with them like I was, but he loved their music. And he thought that Lennon and McCartney were truly gifted, creative songwriters, and that their music was so inventive and so full of juice. And so one of the great experiences of my childhood was to share the Beatles with my dad. And when a new Beatles album was coming out, I would run straight to the record store. Remember record stores? And I would get the new Beatles album and go running home, and I would go barging right into my father's studio. Daddy, Daddy, I got Rubber Soul! And he would say, oh, it's so exciting, let's put it on right now. And we would put it on his nice stereo, and we would sit down together on the couch with the album cover on our laps. Remember album covers? Nice and big. You could read everything on there. And then we would listen to the record. And while we were listening to the record, I would get this running commentary from my dad about what we were listening to. So, when Norwegian Wood came on, he said, oh, listen to that. Do you know what that instrument is? It's a sitar. Do you know what a sitar is? No, of course I didn't know what a sitar was. He explained, it's this stringed instrument from India. It's very ancient, and it's very complicated. It has many strings, and the tunings are very peculiar. And every song is called a raga, and it has its own scale. And so suddenly I was learning a lot about Indian music. This is how my father was. He could never turn off the teaching faucet. He was a compulsive teacher. For us, it was more like a teaching fire hose. My sister jokes that you had to be really careful what question you asked our dad, because if the question was too juicy, you'd be stuck there for an hour getting a great big answer to your question. So this was all so much fun. And then we learned a lot about music just by what our dad would tell us related to the music that we were listening to on the radio. So he was always very interested in every kind of music. So he always wanted to know what we were listening to on our pop station. So in the car, he would always turn on the radio and say, let's catch up. And he would put on, in those days, it was either WABC or WMCA, right? And we would listen to the songs on the radio. And so one time in the car, this awesome song by the Kinks came on. Remember You Really Got Me? Da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da. Girl, you really got me going. You got me so I can't sleep at night. Da-da-da-da-da. Oh, we loved that song. So we're listening to that in the car, and our dad says, hey, this song is in the Mixolydian mode. Do you know what a mode is? No, we didn't know what a mode was. So he proceeded to explain it to us right there in the car about these, ancient scales with Greek names, and that each one can be generated very easily on the piano by starting on a different white note and staying on the white notes. And then you get these unusual scales with unusual intervals. So, okay, that was very interesting. And when we got home, he said, come to the piano, I'm going to show you how it works. And So then we learned all about the modes. And then, just a few months later, his next young people's concert, what do you suppose it was about? Modes. And when he got to the Mixolydian mode, what do you think happened? That's what he did, all right. I'm just moving the cursor over. Yeah, so those young people's concerts, they were a really big deal. Because, when I talk to kids now about my dad, which I love to do, and I do it as often as I can, I love telling them about how everybody watched the young people's concerts back in the day. And I explain to them that the way we used to watch television is everybody sat down together in the living room and watched TV on that one big clunky console that everybody had in the living room. And so when it came to the young people's concerts, multiple generations were all watching these programs together. And so I say to the kids, so how many screens do you have in your house? Really, count them up. You have to count all the TV monitors and all the desktop computers and the laptops and the tablets and your phones. And the kids go crazy counting on their fingers. And I say, have you run out of fingers yet? And of course, many of them have. And it's a great way to illustrate how different the world was back then. And today, if some conductor went on TV and did a young people's concert, how many people would watch it? Not that many, because there are too many options, and everybody's doing their own thing on their own screen. But back then, there were only 3 networks and a smattering of other channels, and everybody had to sit down and watch together. So that was why the young people's concerts had this tremendous impact. So I cannot resist sharing one more clip with you from a young people's concert. And who could resist? Nobody could resist. And my dad was cagey. It was very clever of him to use pop songs, especially Beatles songs, in the middle of his young people's concerts, because it really helped the kids stay focused on what he was talking about, because they could relate to it. It was very smart. But it also gave an unspoken opinion, which was that he was honoring all kinds of music and not making a value judgment between one kind of music or genre of music and another. He was embracing all music as long as it was really good. And that was a really important message, especially for parents of that era, because many of them, thought rock and roll was the devil's music. Remember down south, they used to burn Elvis records and everything? So it was not a small thing that Leonard Bernstein was up there talking about popular music and giving it the same respect as symphonic music. And that was so Lenny anyway, because he was always about building bridges between genres, and his own compositions, as I'm sure you know, love to mix it up. So, his symphonies sound jazzy, and his Broadway shows have symphonic elements. So that was his thing. Anyway, you're probably wondering, well, what about us kids? Were we studying music? Why, yes, we were. We all had to take piano lessons, and we all did not like our piano lessons, and we never practiced, except in that sickening half hour before the piano teacher arrived on Tuesday afternoon. Then I would go to the piano and what was I supposed to have mastered by now, except I haven't sat here for a single minute since the piano teacher left a week ago? It was horrible. And the thing was, we were hearing music being played and performed at its optimum level, all around us, all the time. So then when I would sit down at the piano and these little frogs and spiders would come out of my fingers, this voice in my head said, who are you kidding? What do you think you're doing? This is hopeless. You'll never get anywhere. And since I never practiced, it was definitely true that I never got anywhere. But I had a lucky break because at Camp JCC in Stepney, Connecticut, that I went to one summer, they gave us little folk guitars for a month. And there was a teacher there who taught us 3 chords on these guitars. And with these 3 chords, they taught us a few songs, and one of them was Easy Rider. I was very proud that I could play Easy Rider, so I came home with my little folk guitar. I said, Daddy, Daddy, look what I can do. I can play Easy Rider on the guitar. And so I played in my little Easy Rider, and my father said, well, that's marvelous. And you know, that's a blues. Do you know what a blues is? No, I didn't know what a blues was. So he proceeded to explain to me about the blues pattern, which is very strict. There are just 3 chords, the 1 chord, the 4 chord, and the 5 chord, and it goes 1, 4, 1, 5, 4, 1. That's blues pretty much every time. And so he had actually given me like the Rosetta Stone to understand pop music. And then with those 3 chords and then a few more that I figured out myself, I could pretty much play any song on the radio. And it just opened up a world for me. It gave me a way to make music something that I could own for myself. So then when I was 16, I quit the piano lessons. And then I started playing the piano just for fun and writing my own songs on the piano and on the guitar. And that was all going very well. I was very proud of myself. And then I went off to college, and the bottom dropped out of me. I just didn't know who I was anymore. I had always gone to the same school. I had never left home. I just had a really rough time at Harvard. That was my father's alma mater. And, you know, now we would say I was a Nepo baby. And at the time, I always had this uneasy feeling that, like, if my dad wasn't who he was and an alumnus of this university, would I even be here? So I was very insecure and terribly shy and anxious and not very happy. And so anyway, in my senior year, my brother came into Harvard too, Nepo baby number 2. And so I was a senior and he was a freshman. And meanwhile, the other thing that happened was that in my junior year, guess who came onto the Harvard campus to research and deliver the Charles Eliot Norton Lecture Series? That's right, my dad, Leonard Bernstein. You know, it's not highly recommended to have your parent on the college campus with you. Remember that movie with Rodney Dangerfield? What was it called? What was that movie called? What? Yeah, Back to School. I think that's what it was called. Anyway, it was like that, except not Rodney Dangerfield. And it was all very exciting, and my father was doing something incredibly ambitious, opening up a brand new field of academic inquiry by comparing elements of Chomskyan linguistics with music and tonality. It was a really big idea, and those Norton lectures are incredible. So that was all very exciting and everything, but, you know, on the whole, I kind of wished I could have figured out who I was independent of my last name and my dad, who was right there on campus. There was no escaping it, you know. Also, there was this young man who was our dad's assistant for the research for the Norton lectures. And in my senior year, and now my brother is there as a freshman, we started hearing these rumors about this young man, Tommy. Remember Tommy in the movie of Maestro? That guy. He was helping my father write the Norton lectures. Not write them, research them. And they were sharing a sort of dorm suite in Quincy House. And so my brother and I gradually were beginning to piece together that our father had this other life. And it was, you know, these were early times. It was the early 1970s. And people did not yet have the vocabulary to talk about being bisexual, especially in families. And so at home, everything was sort of normal, but there was this other thing that we were starting to catch on to that nobody was talking about. So that was very, very confusing. Then I'm going to tell you very fast what happened over the next 4 years. The day after my college graduation in June of 1974, my mother sat me down outside on a little bench in Fairfield and told me that they had found a tumor in her breast and she was going in for a mastectomy. That was a horrifying piece of news. And it was early times, you know, they didn't have reconstructive surgery back then or anything. So it was rough. But our mother made a pretty good recovery. And she was sort of back in the swing of things and doing many different things. She went back to acting on Broadway, and that was really exciting. And then in 76, 2 years later, our father, in August, told our mother that he was planning to spend a month in California, Northern California, with Tommy. And our mother said, "Oh, yeah, really? Well, then just don't come back." And our father said, "Okay, I won't." And suddenly our parents were separated and our father was living with a man. And woo-wee, was this a lot to process. And our mother was devastated and mortified too. And you know, she was the one who was stuck in New York having to deal with the people in her life while our dad was off, you know, on the road conducting in Europe or wherever he was going. So he didn't have to deal with the blowback of it, right? It was our mother who had to deal with it. It was very tough. And then the relationship with Tommy could not be sustained. They broke it off after, you know, somewhere in early 1977 we're now up to. And so there was this rapprochement between our parents, and we were so relieved, we were so happy that they were just getting back together, and there was so much joy, but our mother was kind of coughing a lot. So she went to be checked out, and sure enough, her cancer had metastasized to her lungs, and 1 year later, we lost her. All of that I just told you happened in 4 years. That was a lot. So our family was kind of shattered. And it took a long time for us to pull ourselves back together. And so that's a very dark part of the book. But we did manage to find our way back as a family and to rediscover ourselves and to find our joy. Because as a family, we were so close-knit. We enjoyed each other's company so much. And so we found that again, and we found a way to be joyous together again. It took a while, but we got there. Meanwhile, I'm now out of college, and I got it into my head. And looking back on this, I think it was not the greatest decision I ever made. I decided to move to LA and seek my fortune as a singer-songwriter. Even though I still had that voice in my head that said, "Who do you think you are and what do you think you're doing?" Which affected my ability to perform. I had terrible stage fright, anxiety, and I worried about everything. I worried that my fingers would slip off the frets of the guitar. I worried that I would stumble over the notes on the piano. I worried that I would sing off key. I worried that I would forget my lyrics. And therefore, all those things happened. Because, you know, if you really worry enough about something, you can manifest it in the world. So I went off to LA and was having, you know, I made demo tapes and I shopped them around. And long story short, I eventually actually got the record deal. And I made the record. And I handed it back to the record company. And they listened to it and they announced they did not like it. And they were not going to release it. The end. That was really devastating, I'll tell you, after all that work and effort. However, fortunately, I had just gotten married, and I was crazy about my husband, David. So I thought, oh, you know, the hell with this whole music biz. I'm just going to throw myself into my marriage, and maybe we'll start a family. And we did. And in 1987, I gave birth to my daughter, Frankie. And then in 1989, I had my son Evan, and then exactly 1 year later, on October 14th, 1990, Evan's first birthday, Leonard Bernstein died. So October 14th is my annual short circuit day because, yay, it's Evan's birthday, but it's that sad day. So the day our father died, suddenly my brother and sister and I had this new job in life that we had never thought about for a second before, which was we were now the caretakers of our dad's legacy. We never thought about his legacy while he was alive. He was just daddy, and we did all the daddy things with him. We tagged along on his tours, we played tennis and anagrams and swam and, ate corn on the cob, all the fun things that he loved to do and that we loved to do with him. And we never thought about taking care of what he would leave behind, but that was our new job. And luckily he had an office with people who actually knew what they were doing and were, trained in matters of rights and licensing and music editing and all these things that we knew nothing about. But we caught on, and we had to put on our big boy pants and learn how to be adults taking care of this company. So we did that. And a few years later, our father's publisher, Boozy and Hawkes, had this idea. And they asked us, how would it be if we could get somebody to develop a young people's concert just like the ones Bernstein used to do, except about Bernstein himself? And it would be a great way to promote his catalog for orchestras, and they could, introduce Bernstein to their young audiences. And what do you think? Would you like us to try and develop this? And we said, yeah, that's a great idea. And I don't know why, but I raised my hand and I said, I think I would like to help develop that. I'd never done anything like that in my life, but for some reason I just felt like I could do this. But of course I couldn't do the musical part because I was not really a trained musician. So I got my friend Michael Barrett, who was a pianist and conductor and had been my father's assistant conductor and knew all his music by heart, and was a family friend. I said, come on, Mikey, we're going to do this together. You do the music part and I'll do the writing part. And we developed this concert called the Bernstein Beat. It was all about rhythm, which steered us to all the jumpingest Bernstein music that kids would love. And in the end, I wound up narrating it myself, which I didn't think I was going to do. But as I was writing the script, I just felt like I could do it. So we presented this young people's concert, the Bernstein Beat, and it was a huge hit. And we took it all around, including to Carnegie Hall. And the Carnegie Hall people said, that was great. How about doing another one? So we did one about Aaron Copland. Then we did one about Mozart. Then suddenly we did like half a dozen. We had all these concerts and narrations, and I was on the road all the time now, narrating concerts and talking about music, not just to young audiences either, sometimes to grown-ups. And I did it for 5, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 25 years. And I realized, hey, is this my career? Because it turned out that I don't have a problem about talking at all. I can talk. Music making drove me crazy, but I can talk, no problem. And so I had inadvertently found a solution to this lifelong conundrum of mine, which is I love music and I love the world of music, and I found a way to be in that world and to, contribute something useful in that world, just not making the music with my own body. So I was having fun and I had adrenaline, but not panic. And so I think of myself as a kind of musical amputee, but I'm a very cheerful and pretty high-functioning musical amputee, and I love what I do. I love talking about music. I love finding the words to try and explain what music does to us when we listen to it. It's basically impossible, because the whole point of music is that it expresses what we can't express in words. And yet somehow I'm compelled to find the words to explain what the music is expressing. It's like this insane, impossible game. So I love what I do. And that turned out to be a lovely solution to my life. And now that COVID is sorta, kinda behind us, I find that I'm back on the road and narrating concerts again and giving talks of all kinds. The last clip is from 1989, the year before my father died. And it was when the Berlin Wall came down. And my father was so ecstatic about this one piece of really good news in the world. He spent his whole life being so devoted to trying to make the world a better place. He was, a lifelong activist and humanitarian. And here was this one really wonderful thing that had happened in Berlin. And so he decided to put together this very special performance of Beethoven's Ninth. And musicians from orchestras all over the world volunteered to be in this concert. It was an amazing event, and the concert was televised worldwide, live on Christmas Day, 1989. And so I just thought it would be lovely to watch the very end of Beethoven's Ninth. Pretty great, right? Berlin. Because the wall had just come down. And that was the celebration. And instead of singing the ode to joy, Freude, just for this one time, my father asked the chorus and the soloist to sing Freiheit, freedom, ode to freedom. He said, I'm pretty sure Beethoven wouldn't mind. And I'm sure he's right, because Beethoven was a humanitarian too. And that's what Beethoven's Ninth is all about. So I think it would have been right up Ludwig's alley. So who's got questions? Any questions? Yeah, now we're going to talk about Maestro a little bit. Was I involved? Were my brother and sister and I? We were really involved. So when Bradley Cooper acquired the project, and it had existed already in other incarnations, and he acquired it about 6 years ago. And once we gave him the green light to make the film and use the Bernstein music, at that point, he had the option of never talking to us again, because it was his movie. But because he decided to tell this very personal, intimate story about the marriage and the family, rather than just making it a conventional biopic, because of the decision he made, he stayed in very close contact with my brother and sister and me, and he asked us millions of questions and shared versions of the screenplay, and he was striving for authenticity. So he was in touch with us all the time. And his striving for authenticity was to such a degree that he asked if he could shoot part of the film at our house in Fairfield, which he did. So that's really our house that you see in the movie. And he is Bradley Cooper is adorable, yes. He's not like a normal movie star. He's not vain, and he's very emotional and very kind of real and solid. He's a mensch, really. If he had seen today's artists, you mean? I don't know. I'm not sure I understood the question, but if you meant, what would our dad think of today's popular music? I have no idea, because to tell the truth, I'm a little unplugged myself from today's popular music. So unlike my father, I do not go, let's catch up, and turn on the pop station. And so by now, I've lost track. And I bet if my dad were alive, he would be a lot more clued into what's going on than I am now. Well, what did he listen to at home? Well, he didn't really listen to music for leisure, because it was busman's holiday. He had so much music around him and in his ears and in his head that he, just as a matter of course in his work, that he didn't just put music on just for the hell of it. So more often it was me putting on a record and having him listen to it. So that's why he heard so much Beatles music because I was putting it on all the time. Oh, who's my favorite Beatle? Oh, thanks for asking. In the very beginning, it was George, but I quickly switched to John and stayed with John evermore. And one thing I write about in my book is the night that Lennon was killed. I was there in the Dakota when that happened, and I heard the shots. And it was, you can imagine, it was shattering. My father himself characterized himself as being two people in one body, because he was very outgoing, very gregarious, and the communicator and the teacher, and that was the Bernstein that, you know, loved to be surrounded by people and loved rehearsals and going on tours and playing the piano at parties till 4 a.m. That was one of him. The other of him was the creative artist, the composer, and to compose he had to be all alone. He hated being all alone. Composing was agony for him because he really did not like being alone, but he felt compelled to compose. And so when he was composing, he would, if he was in Fairfield, his studio was a separate little building, used to be the stables. And my mother converted it into a studio for my dad. So, you know, he worked best late at night. He was a total insomniac. So 4 a.m. was sort of his prime working hour. And then that left him time to, you know, be with us at dinner and hang out and maybe do something fun after dinner, you know, play all the games that we played. Trivial Pursuit, or the one we really loved to make him play later on was Pictionary, because he could not draw anything. You know, for all the talent and gifts that he had in his ears, in his visual acuity, not so much. And he couldn't draw a cat. He couldn't draw a bone. So we loved to make him play Pictionary because he would not be very good at it, and that made us feel better. Yes, the question was there one kind of music he preferred writing? I think he gravitated towards theatrical music for a couple of reasons. One, he loved words every bit as much as he loved notes, and so he loved when things were text-driven. And you would be hard put to find a symphonic work of his that isn't text-driven, even if it has no words in the piece itself. His Serenade, which is my favorite symphonic piece of his, is based on Plato's Symposium. His Symphony No. 2, The Age of Anxiety, is based on Auden's poem of the same name, and so on. But the other reason that I think he loved writing for theater and ballet and opera is that he had collaborators, so he wasn't so alone, you know? Yes, he would have to be all alone when he finally put those notes to paper, but then the next day he could play them for the team, and then it was more convivial, and I think he really enjoyed that. What did he study at Harvard? He studied music and literature. Well, he studied everything, and that's why he went to Harvard. He did not want to go to a music conservatory and be restricted to learning only about music because his curiosity was so universal. He wanted to know about everything. So he did study music at Harvard, but along with everything else. And then after Harvard, he went to the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia for 2 years. And that was where he studied conducting. And he also studied at Tanglewood in the summers with Serge Koussevitzky, who was his great beloved mentor. Oh. Do I remember when my father was working on West Side Story? Well, I was 5 years old, okay? So I have to tell you, I don't remember too much about it. And I wasn't allowed to see it because it was too violent, and I was only 5 years old. So I didn't see West Side Story on Broadway until it had gone on the road, on tour, across the country, and then came back to Broadway a few years later, and by then I was like 7 or 8, and then I was allowed to see West Side Story. And even then, I have to say, the gunshot, I practically hit the ceiling. I hate sudden loud noises to this very day. And that was maybe the primal one, was that gunshot in West Side Story. Because my father himself always wished that he had composed more than the amount that he did. Looking back on it, it's really unbelievable how much he did compose, given that he was constantly conducting. And because he was those two people, he really needed the conducting. And the conducting was so rewarding because he was really good at it. And audiences loved it. And he was surrounded by people and traveling the world. I mean, it was a blast. So it's amazing that, given how much of that he was doing, that he still managed to churn out as many pieces as he did. And we all wish, including him himself, that there were more compositions. But I think we're pretty lucky that we got as many as we did. What happened to Tony? Oh, Tommy. You know what happened to Tommy? He died of AIDS. That's what happened to Tommy Cawthron. And he was one of the early victims. He had lymphoma. They didn't even know it was AIDS yet, but then they figured out that it was. That was tragic. And my father had stayed in touch with him and even went to visit him when he was very, very sick. Yeah, he died in the early 80s. I guess that's when people started dying of AIDS. So he was right on schedule with that. And my father lived, all the way to 1990. So yeah. So on that sad note, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you.